What's up? What's up? What up, Sci Fam? It's your boy Nickel. Today we're going to take a look at speciation. So, speciation, we'll begin with a definition of adaptation. We'll take a look at some review from natural selection, and we'll end with our definition of speciation. So you can set your science notebook page up like that, and let's begin. So first, let's define what an adaptation is. An adaptation is simply a structure like maybe ears or beak or height, some structure that changes the organism, or a function, how an organism is able to use something that it already has. So it's a structure or function that provides a greater ability for an organism to survive in its particular environment. And it's important to think about this particular environment, because where an organism lives is important, and what traits it has will help us survive in that particular environment. Now, it's not only for survival, but something that's important is if you can survive, then you can also reproduce. So I want to just add this in here, that it also has to do with reproduction. So a species surviving, or an adaptation, allows the species to survive and later go on to reproduce and pass on those same traits to its offspring. Now, traits do not evolve on demand. You know, on demand means, well, you can just go on YouTube and search for a video and boom, it's right there. What you want, what you need pops right up because you ask for it. Well, traits do not evolve on demand because a species needs them. Also, we need to understand that natural selection acts on existing variations. So it's not on demand, but existing variations are then selected for or against based on the environment or organisms within the species. So traits don't evolve on demand, but instead natural selection acts on existing variations of traits. In a population. All right, so an adaptation is a structure or function that provides a greater ability for an organism to survive or reproduce in its particular environment, and traits do not evolve, which I just noticed I have a spelling error here. Let's revise that. Evolve on demand because the species needs them, but instead natural selection acts on existing variations of traits in a population. So let's take a look at an example here. We're going to take a look at the medium ground finch. The finches are pretty famous because they are the famous example of Charles Darwin, who studied the finches on the Galapagos Islands. And specifically, we're going to take a look at beak size. Now, right offhand, it might not be easy to notice beak size, but there's a lot of differences that can happen to birds based on their beak. And their beak is basically a tool that allows them to do a job, like crack open a seed or get into a little small area to pick out the food. It can do a variety of different functions. Now, specifically, medium ground finches, their diet is going to include small insects, fruit, and seeds of plants, and the fruit and seeds of cactuses as well. So you can imagine if a finch is going to be eating insects, so a certain type of beak might work better compared to fruit, seeds of plants, and especially seeds or fruits of a cactus. Cactus have some different things about them, spiky things about them, that might make it more challenging for a bird to be able to just use any old beak to get in there to do its job. So, based on the fact that they have some different beak sizes, if we looked at every single medium ground finch, we'd find that some of them might have some smaller beaks, some of them might have some larger beaks. Most of them, though, are going to have something in the middle. Now, as we go to each side, as we head towards the smaller, we might find that there's some that do have a little bit smaller than average. Maybe a few less have even smaller than that, and even fewer are going to have the smallest beaks. And the same is true if we go the other direction. If we look at the average, there's some that will be a little bit larger than average, maybe even a little bit larger than average, and even the largest beaks, all within the same species. They can have a variation in their actual beak size. So what natural selection then does is that as the environment changes, or let's say that there's a flood or a drought, or there's an abundant amount of clouds which cause there to be less photosynthesis happening, which means less plant growth. So whatever it is that happens in the environment, natural selection causes a change in the average. So if we take a look, if I were to highlight an area, let's say that this is the average beak size right here in the middle. Well, natural selection is going to then impact beak size. So let's say, for example, that the seeds are harder to open, and therefore all of those finches that have these larger beaks are the only ones that reproduce. They pass on their genes, and if we look at the population of those finches, then we're going to notice that a lot more of the finches actually have larger beaks. Fewer of them will have beaks that are a little bit smaller, and if we get more close to the small end of the scale here, fewer of them were able to survive that had the smaller beak. Now, some of them could have survived that had small beaks, but most of them that survived are going to have larger beaks. So now, if we look at the average, the overall average has changed to this larger beak size. Now, we could say that the opposite is true. Maybe there's a lot smaller seeds that are available, and so those birds that had the large beaks, well, not many of them survived because their beak is so big they couldn't be dexterous and get that small seed. But if they had smaller beaks, well, more and more of those individuals survived, which means that if we look at the overall average beak size of the finches, the average has now changed. The average is now closer to having a smaller beak. So you could see here, just in this simple example of these medium ground finches, how if the food resource changes, the average beak size could change as well based on what's available in the environment. And that causes a change to the traits of the finch. All right, so let's now look at speciation, because you could imagine that if we end up having some type of natural selection event that causes larger beaks versus smaller beaks, we're now going to see differences within the same species. So what does it take for one species to become two species or multiple species? Well, if it does occur, it's called speciation. And speciation is how a new kind of either plant or animal, because plants can go through all of these changes as well. A lot of times we might think that it's only animals because we are animals, but plants also go through natural selection and speciation. So speciation is how a new kind of plant or animal a new kind of plant or animal species is created. Oh, there we go. So how a new kind of plant or animal species is created is what speciation is called. So if we take a look back at our example, if these did become two different species, a large beaked finch and a small beaked finch, well, how it happened is what speciation is going to define. So this actually is going to occur when, whoa, I'm getting all over the place with my zoom in here. It occurs when a group within the species develops new or unique. Unique means something that wasn't there before. So when a group within the species develops unique characteristics that separate it from its original group. So it's like if most of those finches had that medium-sized beak size here as the average, and now we have the average as the higher or the lower end of the spectrum, we now have a group within this species of medium finch. A group within that species now has a unique characteristic, either a smaller or a larger beak, and that separates it from its overall group. So therefore, it could become a new species. Now, some ways that this can happen. It can happen through four main ways, and there's probably more ways than this, but this might get you thinking on some different things that could cause speciation to occur. So one of them is going to be considered geographic isolation. So if you think of like geography means like place. So essentially it's like if they're in different locations. So let's say that, maybe there's the main or some island over here, we'll call it island A, and here's the mainland over here, we'll call it B. If there's some type of, let's say, some type of bird that's over here, and there's also a bird over here, well, since they live in different locations, if this one flew over here, had babies, and those babies stayed over here, these babies might end up creating new traits because they're in a new location. this location is going to have different types of stresses on it than the population over on the mainland would have. So that geographic isolation, the location that they're at or that they're living within, could cause there to be different traits that are favored, which could cause speciation to occur. Next, we have behavioral isolation. And you'll see isolation is a common term here because isolation means that something's being isolated. So this could just be something like mating preference. So maybe there's a type of bird within the species that likes a lower pitched noise, which they're going to be more attracted to birds that make the lower pitch mating call versus a higher pitch mating call. And that behavior could cause there to be an isolation within the group, which causes there to be unique traits that are passed on, which causes speciation. Something else that could cause speciation would be a temporal, and temporal is a fancy way of saying time. So let's put that there in parentheses. Temporal isolation. Now, this is something that could relate to like breeding season. So maybe there is one part of the species that starts to be more fertile earlier on in the breeding season or later on in the breeding season. This change in time of when it can reproduce could cause there to be different characteristics that are then passed on. Another thing to think about when it comes to temporal isolation or time isolation, you can think about flowers. Some flowers bloom earlier on in spring, some later in summer. And if it's going to bloom earlier on in the spring, then that pollen could never be transported to a flower that blooms later on in the season. So the time in which it's actually prepared to go through that process of breeding could create some speciation events. And lastly, we have the opportunity for habitat isolation. And habitat isolation is basically related to whether or not some type of organism might prefer one habitat versus another. So it could we could have a species of, let's say, a type of, maybe there's a type of squirrel, and the type of squirrel likes to live near aquatic environments because it can find different types of slugs and other types of food around the aquatic environments versus terrestrial environments, more tree type environments where it's going to be more forest and grasslands and such. Now, I don't even know if, not sure if squirrels eat slugs or not, but the idea here is that there might be a preference of where certain species like to live. Maybe some certain birds like living more on the coast, some like to live more in the trees or in the terrestrial regions. So that can be the type of habitat that it prefers, could cause there to be differences within the species to give them those unique traits or those unique types of characteristics that allow it to separate from its original group, causing there to be a speciation event. So if you imagine there's the original species and something happens that then causes that A species to have a certain type of trait that maybe now it's the AB and the AZ species. And yes, they might have some similarities. They both have that A characteristic, but based on the environment, the habitat, the time that they prefer, that B or the Z then is going to cause there to be differences in that species. So we end up with two species. We might have started with the A species, but because of natural selection and adaptation to the environment, we end up with two species, the AB species and the AZ species. Just an example. Anyway, that's speciation. I'll catch you on the next one. See ya.